Let us see another terminology, that is rocket. See, what is meant by rocket? So rocket is simply, it is a vehicle which carries satellites into the space. Rocket is a simply launch vehicle, you can say, which carries the satellites or which carries the payloads, into the space, that is called as a rocket. So that means this rocket provides thrust for an object. So its work is based on Newton's third law of motion. It works is based on Newton's third law of motion. What is Newton's third law? The Newton's third law says that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Suppose say action is equal and opposite in direction. So Newton's third law says that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That is called as a Newton's third law. Suppose here the rocket is having propellant. So what is meant by propellant? Propellant means it is a combination of fuel and an oxidizer. That is called as a propellant. Suppose when you burn a fuel, the emitted gases will provide a thrust in the opposite direction. So that means when you burn a fuel here, the gases will be emitted, and these emitted gases will provide a thrust or will push the rocket in opposite direction. So this is called as a fuel. Otherwise, rocket, simply you remember what is meant by rocket. Rocket is a launching vehicle which provides a thrust for an object. Okay, this launching of rocket depends on the launching of rocket is based on the Newton's third law of motion. So what is Newton's third law? Newton's third law says that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So burning of a fuel will provide a thrust in the opposite direction to push the rocket into the space. So that is called as the Newton's third law. And this rocket consists of propellant. Propellant means it is a fuel, combination of fuel and oxidizer. The fuel may be solid fuel, liquid fuel, or it may be cryogenic fuel. We will discuss it later in the further classes. Okay. Then payload. So what is meant by payload? Any object sent into the space, that is called as payload. The payload may be a satellite, a payload may be an astronaut, payload may be a spaceship. So payloads may be a satellite, astronaut, or spaceship. So what is meant by satellite? Satellite means an object which revolves around another object, that is called as a satellite. Okay, these satellites may be either natural or man-made, artificial satellite. And what are astronauts? Astronauts means the space travelers. The space travelers are called as astronauts. And what are spaceships? So these are also objects which are designed to enter into the space. With the help of that, we can explore the space. So these are called spaceships. So payload means any object which is sent into the space, that is called as payload. The payload may be a satellite, or an astronaut, or spaceships, or you can say spacecrafts, And then satellite. Let us see satellite. So what is meant by satellite? A body that revolves around another object. An object which revolves around another object is called as a satellite. So these satellites, they may be of two types. It may be natural satellite or it may be man-made. So these man-made satellites, these are called as artificial satellites. The man-made satellites are called artificial satellites. For example, AstroSat. So AstroSat is an astronomical satellite. AstroSat is an astronomical satellite to observe the celestial bodies. So what is meant by artificial satellite? It is a man-made satellite. So for example, AstroSat. This AstroSat is an astronomical satellite. Astronomical satellite which is mainly meant for observing the celestial bodies, for objects, that is called as a artificial satellite. And natural satellites. So this natural satellite example is moon. So moon is natural satellite. suppose if you consider the moon, suppose say this is the earth and say this is a moon. Moon revolves around the earth. So moon revolves around the earth. Here, when the moon revolves around the earth, it requires centripetal force to stay in a particular path, to stay in a particular orbit. So this centripetal force, what is centripetal force? The force which is existing to keep an object in its path, that is called as centripetal force, or the force which is acting towards the center, that is called as a centripetal force. Here the moon is revolving around the earth, To keep this moon in its orbit, we require a centripetal force. How will get this centripetal force? Here the earth is having gravitational force. Gravitational force of the earth will pull the moon towards the center. That means the gravitational pull or gravitational force of the earth will keep the moon in its path. That means the gravitational force of the earth will provide the centripetal force. Okay. Here the centripetal force should equal to the centrifugal force. Then only the object will be placed in its path. In a similar manner, in the artificial satellite, and this artificial satellite will be launched into Earth's orbit. Okay. So here gravitational force of the earth will provide the necessary centripetal force to keep the satellites in its path. So simply you remember, satellite means a object that revolves around another object, that is called as a satellite. The satellites may be of two types. One is natural satellite, another one is artificial satellite. So this artificial satellite is a man-made satellite which can be launched into the space for space exploration. But the best example is AstroSat. Another type of InSat satellites, communication satellites, IRS, Earth observation satellites. These are all artificial satellites. And natural satellite is an example of moon. Natural satellite example is moon. That means the moon revolves around Earth. When the moon revolves around Earth, it requires a centripetal force to keep in its path. So the necessary centripetal force is provided by the gravitational pull of the earth. In a similar manner, the artificial satellite can be launched into the Earth's orbit. So the earth will provide the necessary centripetal force to keep the satellite in its path. So in its path, that is called as centripetal force. Okay. And here another terminology you have to remember, that is orbital velocity. Here you have to remember what is orbital velocity. So orbital velocity is the minimum velocity required to keep the object in its orbit. So this is called as an orbital velocity. So this orbital velocity should be 7.9 kilometers per second. So this is the minimum amount of velocity required to keep an object in its path, in its orbit. That is called as a orbital velocity. These terminologies you have to remember.